Alright, so before we begin, a couple of household updates. I just got back from a short trip to Germany over the weekend, hence the lack of content. I want to wish all of you happy holidays, and there will be one more upload after this one before we enter the new year. A year that will probably be filled with even more groundbreaking developments and updates in the world of international relations, geopolitics, and security. In this Flashpoint, Sudan, the Philippines, New Caledonia, Syria, and North Korea. On Monday, Sudanese police fired tear gas at protesters in the capital Khartoum. Police fired tear gas at protesters who rallied near the presidential palace in the capital Khartoum to voice their anger against the military deal that reinstated Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. Thousands of people took to the streets in Khartoum and other Sudanese cities on Monday as part of relentless demonstrations against the October military coup and subsequent deal that has allowed the military to remain part of the transitional council formed in 2019 following the overthrow of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dissolved the military civilian sovereign council on October 25th that had been set up to guide the country to democracy and declared a state of emergency across the country. Mass protests and international condemnation against this move forced al-Burhan, who was also the head of the governing council, to reinstate Hamdok last month. He has also promised to hold elections in July 2023 and hand over power to an elected civilian government. But pro-democracy groups, who were at the forefront of the uprising that toppled al-Bashir, have criticized the deal to reinstate Hamdok. They have said the military should not be part of the government as they cannot be trusted to lead the transition to democracy. Protesters in Khartoum waved Sudanese flags and chanted, quote, "Civilian is the people's choice," end quote, as well as, quote, "The people are stronger," end quote. Ahmed Latif, an eyewitness, said police used tear gas, rubber bullets, and sticks to disperse protests near the palace in Khartoum. There was no comment from Sudanese authorities on the claim. On Tuesday, a new study by ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, suggested that drug war violence has become increasingly concentrated in the central Luzon region of the Philippines, with Nueva Ecija province recently surpassing Metro Manila and Bulacan to become the new epicenter of the war. New supplemental data for the Philippines add nearly 1,000 events and more than 1,100 fatalities to the ACLED dataset for the period of 2016 to the present, expanding the coverage of the country's war on drugs. This report analyzes key trends from the data and sheds new light on the drug war civilian death toll. Last month, the Philippine Department of Justice, the DOJ, completed a review into 52 deaths during police anti-drug operations, concluding that criminal charges ought to be levied against 154 police officers. This marks a rare admission by the Philippine state that it may be complicit in abuses stemming from the war on drugs, which continue to this day. While the 52 deaths under investigation represent a very small fraction of drug war fatalities, the Justice Minister announced last month that the DOJ will now look into thousands of other killings that have resulted from anti-drug operations. Following the announcement, President Rodrigo Duterte stated his admission of full responsibility for the drug war, although, quote, maintained he will never be tried by an international court, end quote. His comments came as the judges at the International Criminal Court approved a formal investigation into possible crimes against humanity committed under his leadership. The government allegedly admitted that over 6,000 killings have occurred during police operations in association with the drug war. Many officers, however, have already been absolved of any wrongdoing in those incidents during internal police investigations. While the DOJ's plan to review these killings is a welcome step for many victims' families, analysis of new accurate data finds that the civilian toll of the war on drugs perpetrated by the state and its supporters is much higher than the official figure suggests. At least 7,742 Philippine civilians have been killed in anti-drug operations since 2016, 25% higher than the government's count, even by a conservative estimate. While the overall rate of violence has declined since the height of the drug war in 2016, when Duterte first took office, there have been important changes in trends, including a shift in the primary perpetrators of the war, as well as the geography of violence, which this report also goes into. Anti-drug, quote, vigilantes, largely assumed to have links to the Philippine security infrastructure, were responsible for nearly half, approximately over 48% of civilian targeting during the early days of the drug war in 2016. Since 2020, however, there has been an upward trend in the proportion of state involvement in drug war violence. The Philippine state has taken an increasingly large role in targeting civilians itself, no longer trying to create distance by, quote, outsourcing the majority of violence to vigilantes. So far in 2021, state forces have accounted for about 80% of civilian targeting in the drug war. The shift appears to be driven by increased scrutiny around vigilantes by the media and international community, as well as dynamics around competing state priorities as the government fights other wars along multiple fronts. On Wednesday, the final results of an independence referendum in French Caledonia in the Pacific became known. The final results of an independence referendum in the French territory of New Caledonia show almost 2/3 of voters abstained or returned blank or null ballots, after a call for a boycott by supporters of independence. Pro-independence parties in New Caledonia have rejected the result of a referendum which overwhelmingly approved the Pacific territory remaining part of France. While acknowledging that for the moment there is no concrete evidence of electoral interference from China in New Caledonia, an official from the Cabinet of France Overseas Minister Sébastien Lecornu said the government will be particularly vigilant and pointed to what already happened in other Melanesian islands where Beijing's presence is more evident, including in votes. A total of 96.49% of ballots cast in Sunday's referendum were against independence, while only 3.51% were in favor. In the second vote in 2020, 47% of people voted for independence, which was an increase from the 43% that voted in it in 2018. Now, a bit of historical context. In the 1980s, the Front de Libération Nationale Kanak et Socialiste, the FLNKS, was founded under the leadership of Jean-Marie Thibault. In November 1984, violent clashes broke out between the pro-independence Kanaks and the Europeans who opposed independence. Thibault, leader of the Kanaka Socialist National Liberation Front, the Melanesian independence movement, reacted to the deaths of the two front leaders by rejecting the referendum and calling for immediate and complete independence. Those were followed by violent riots in the capital, Numo, causing France to declare a state of emergency lasting 6 months. On January 22, 1985, France announced that it was sending 1,000 more troops to the South Pacific territory. There were already 280 French military police and 3,000 regular army troops in New Caledonia. A transitional regime was instituted during this period that allowed different groups to voice their concerns and issues about New Caledonia's progress towards independence. Thibault was assassinated in 1989 by radical members of the FLNKS who believed that he had sold out the Kanaks by his participation in the peace process. The violence began to settle down in the early 1990s, but the proposed vote was later postponed by the 1998 Numo Accord that gave New Caledonia greater autonomy from France and further postponed the vote on independence until 2014-2019. New Caledonian citizenship was supposedly also established. France at that point claimed that the delay in the vote was due to fears of renewed violence, while some suspect that the actual reason was because France did not want to change loosening New Caledonia's economic assets. New Caledonia is believed to have around a quarter of the world's nickel deposits, in addition to having one of the region's highest average incomes per capita. China is by far New Caledonia's top export destination, and its share in the archipelago's exports is growing at an impressive clip. In 2010, China accounted for 4% of New Caledonian exports, and now, currently in 2021, buys 57%. In 2019, Chinese investors approached to take a stake in a nickel factory controlled by the South Province, but with the backing of the Elysee, their offer was rejected. A major nickel mine in the North Province, which is ruled by pro-independence politicians, already has a partnership with China's Yichuan nickel industry. New Caledonia's pro-independence coalition, the Kanak and Socialist Liberation Front, the FLNKS, insists that China is just one among several international partners, and not a threat. A very explicit warning also came from a research center of the French Defense Ministry, the IRSEM. The islands are a key part of France's claim of being a Pacific power, with New Caledonia granting Paris rights to the surrounding ocean, as well as serving as a military staging post. The fourth referendum is expected in 2023, and it's also expected to confirm New Caledonia's new legal status. The chances are that the independence movement will dispute the legality of the poll and continue its struggle. The possibility of getting the independence in 2023 is high, because of Chinese activity and policy by this year New Caledonia's elected president, Louis Mappo, the UNI leader, who is the first pro-independence president since the 1998 deal with Paris. On Thursday, December 16th, it became known that a British RAF Typhoon has shot down a small hostile drone in Syria. It is the first time the British military has downed another enemy aircraft since the Falkland Wars, nearly 40 years ago. The Ministry of Defense said that the drone, which was shot on 14 December, quote, posed a threat, end quote, to coalition forces fighting the Islamic State group in southern Syria. It did not say which hostile group was operating the drone. 2 FGR-4 jets were on a routine patrol from their base in Cyprus when they were asked to investigate the small drone on Tuesday. The pilots reportedly identified and destroyed it using an advanced short-range air-to-air missile called AS-RAM. The incident took place near the Al-Tanf coalition military base close to the border with Iraq. An AS-RAM missile, which costs around 200,000 British pounds and has a range of 12 to 15 miles, flies at supersonic speed, faster than the speed of sound. Alleged defense sources told the BBC this engagement would likely have been a relatively close encounter, possibly with the aircrew in line of sight of the much slower flying drone. Now on Friday, December 17th, Reuters published a piece about North Korean crackdowns on defectors. The article found that in the 10 years since Kim Jong-un came to power, North Korea has cracked down on people trying to get out of the country, leaving many defectors without hope of seeing their families or homeland again. Even before the coronavirus pandemic slowed the number of defectors to a trickle, Kim oversaw increased controls and pressed China to tighten measures on its side of the border as well. Only 2 North Korean defectors entered South Korea from April to June this year, the fewest ever in a single quarter, according to the South Korea's Unification Ministry, which handles relations with the North. Activists say several hundred might arrive in a typical quarter. Quote, "He has unconditionally blocked all North Koreans defecting from the country," end quote, said Ha Jin-woo, who worked as a, quote, broker in North Korea to help defectors leave before fleeing himself in 2013. An initial rise in gross domestic product and improved livelihoods have been undercut by international sanctions imposed over Kim's pursuit of nuclear weapons, the ministry said, while a United Nations rights investigator says self-imposed anti-pandemic border controls risk causing starvation among vulnerable North Koreans. Changes in style, such as Kim showing apparent emotions last year during a speech about people's hardships, have not translated into systemic reforms. And Kim has overseen crackdowns in other areas, such as on foreign media. Another quote, "Under Kim Jong-un, I felt more discipline at school," end quote, said Park, a 23-year-old defector who left North Korea in 2014 and asked to be identified only by his last name. Quote, "For example, the school cracked down more on school uniforms and hair. They more strictly prohibited South Korean movies or music," end quote. At least 7 people have been put to death under Kim for watching or distributing K-pop videos, according to a report by a Seoul-based human rights group, which I will add in the description under this video. In an eventful week in terms of developments in international relations, geopolitics, and security, this has been your Flashpoint. See you all next week.